Do you believe in the devil? Well, I certainly hope you do, because today we're talking about the supernatural enemy of the Bible, Satan himself. And if you don't believe in the devil, it's my hope that by the end of this video, you will. Welcome back to the Plague of Frogs. There are two equal and opposite errors into which our kind can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence, and the other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are quite equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. Do you believe in the devil? When I ask if you believe in Jesus, I'm asking if you accept Jesus as the Lord and Savior of your life. But when I ask you if you believe in the devil, I'm more interested in whether or not you believe that Satan, the Prince of Darkness, really exists. Historically, especially in the West, but in other parts of the world as well, the existence of the devil is something taken for granted by most people. Satan's existence is just as self-evident as the earth beneath our feet or the heavenly sky above our heads. But in recent years, alternatives to belief in both God and the devil have caused a lot of people to reevaluate whether they actually believe in a figure known as the Prince of Darkness. If you're anything like me, then when you think of the devil, you're probably thinking of a story that goes something like this. Satan, formerly called Lucifer, was the highest of the angels of God until he attempted to set himself up as higher than God. This sin of pride led Satan to mount a heavenly rebellion against the Almighty, which led to his inevitable failure. Satan was cast down to earth, where he took the form of the serpent and tempted Adam and Eve to likewise betray God's command. Ever since then, Satan has stood as the opposing force against God and the ruler of the dark world that we all inhabit. He is the tempter of mankind and is able to influence his evil in the hearts of every human being on the face of the planet. This is the story about Satan that's entered into popular imagination, both in the Christian realm and in the non-Christian realm, at least in the modern West. But what's interesting about this story is that we actually don't find this narrative in its entirety in any part of the Bible, Old or New Testament. The story is put together piecemeal in the early church, assembled from various pieces of narrative and theology and philosophical speculation until we arrive at the aggregate story that I shared with you a second ago. This video is going to serve as something of a biography of the devil. We're going to explore the history of belief in the devil, the ideas by which he was expressed from its earliest time all the way down to the beginnings of the modern era. We're going to dig deep into the story of Satan and then answer the question, how should we think about the devil in the 21st century? So here's the plan for the video. First, we're going to start in the Old Testament, looking at texts that are traditionally identified as referring to the Prince of Darkness. Following this, we're going to move on to what's called the Second Temple period. This is the time period between the end of the Old Testament period and the setting for which the New Testament was written in. Following our excursion into the Second Temple period, we're going to spend some time in the New Testament itself. Following the New Testament's completion, we're going to move into the early church and evaluate how Satan was perceived among early Christianity. Finally, we're going to wrap everything up with a discussion of what we should think about Satan in the modern day. If any of these chapters particularly interest you, you're welcome to skip around, although I would recommend watching them all in order, as I think we're going to see linear continuity flow from one to the other, and it'll be difficult to ascertain certain details in one section if you haven't already familiarized yourself with the ideas expressed in another section. So I recommend watching them from one to the other, but if you would like to skip around a little bit, that's okay too. Before we explore the history of the devil, it's important to look at where we're standing from right now as we look back through history. It's interesting that regardless of whether one considers themselves religious or secular, the perspective on the devil that a lot of us have today is pretty consistent. A lot of us understand the devil to be the Prince of Darkness, the ruler of the evil world and the embodiment of evil. He's the polar opposite of God. And in a lot of our representations, be it artwork or music or just popular understanding, the devil and God are arm wrestling for control over the world. God represents the forces of light and good, whereas the devil represents the forces of evil, death, and destruction. The reason I bring that up is because a lot of modern American Christianity and thoughts on the devil in general in the secular zeitgeist is very dualistic. We like to portray God and the devil as playing on the same footing in a sense, even if we know that God is ultimately supreme over Satan. The reason that's important to note is because modern American applications of Christianity are often a lot more dualistic than ancient Israelite and Christian representations were. In fact, we really don't see a whole lot of dualism in the Old Testament of the Bible at all. We see more of it crop up in the Second Temple period, as we'll explore, and it seeps its way into the New Testament as well, but never as strongly as we see it today. In other words, we have to be very careful when we read biblical texts that we don't read our modern presuppositions, our modern understandings of the devil. We have to be careful that we don't read those into a text where they're not actually present. As we'll see, in many biblical texts, the devil is represented as being completely powerless compared to God, which is very different from its representation in a lot of modern American understandings of that duel between light and dark. I also want to emphasize how relatively small of an actor the devil is on the stage of the Bible and Christian theology as a whole. It's rather surprising how infrequently the character of the devil actually shows up in the Bible. This comes as a surprise to a lot of us because most of us are used to the idea that the whole Bible is a series of conflicts between God and Satan as they wrestle for control over the world. But again, this is us reading our modern dualism into the biblical world. Satan, as it turns out, is a relatively small actor on the biblical stage. The Bible rarely contains any examples of what we would call a systematic theology, but the closest thing we get is the Apostle Paul's book of Romans. Surprisingly, throughout the entirety of Romans, as it's laying out the Christian theological system as espoused by the Apostle Paul, the devil never shows up except for what's essentially a throwaway line in the concluding chapter. This goes to show that, for as important as the devil is, he isn't a vital piece of Christian theology in the outplaying of God's plan here on earth. This isn't to downplay the importance or the gravity of the concept of the devil, but it's just to show that the dualism that we appreciate today, that we look at the Bible with, that we look at the world with, isn't really reflective of a lot of ancient texts. We do see dualism pop up from time to time in the New Testament, but for the most part, we see the idea that God is in control and it's human affairs that are really at stake here. With all that being said, I would suggest that if we want to get to know who the devil is and what the devil is, then we should start by looking at the history of the concept of the devil, how he was understood and represented from the oldest texts all the way up to modern day, or as close as we dare get. So with that in mind, let's move into the Old Testament and see how the Old Testament represents the figure of Satan. Now, you might expect that if we're going to be looking for Satan in the Old Testament, the logical place to begin is in Genesis chapter 3. This is the Garden of Eden story. And we all know how this story goes. Adam and Eve are placed in the garden as the crown of God's creation until along comes Satan, disguised or manifested as a serpent, and tempts Adam and Eve to bite the fruit from the forbidden tree. After doing so, Adam and Eve are excommunicated from the garden, and evil enters into the world. But there's a problem with this. The text never actually calls the serpent Satan. It never refers to him as the devil. Rather, the serpent is simply called the serpent throughout the entirety of the narrative. The morality of the serpent character in the Adam and Eve story is actually somewhat ambiguous. Some scholars affirm that it is actually a malicious force, but others will maintain that it's actually a more morally ambiguous character with more difficult understandings of the morality of the serpent emerging from those ideas. But one way or another, the serpent is never actually referred to as the devil, either in the Old Testament or directly in the New Testament texts. Others have tried to maintain that the character of the serpent must be Satan or the devil because serpents were seen as symbols of evil in the ancient world. But this wasn't entirely true. Certainly sometimes serpents were used as symbols of danger, death, and evil, but other times they were used as symbols for eternal life, wisdom, and reproductive benefits. If you want to know more about the symbolism of serpents, you can watch the first video on this channel on the history of the Nehushtan. But suffice it to say that just because serpents were considered symbols of death and disease by some, they weren't universal symbols of evil. So if Satan doesn't show up in the Adam and Eve story, where do we begin? I would suggest that we begin by taking a look at the word Satan, what it means, and what it doesn't mean. The word Satan shows up 26 times in the Old Testament of the Bible, in the Hebrew text. It shows up an additional 6 times as a related verbal form. Now, when the word Satan shows up, it doesn't necessarily refer to the Prince of Darkness. Sometimes it does refer to supernatural figures, but sometimes it refers to human figures, defined by this word as well. Likewise, sometimes these figures are hostile to the protagonists of the story, but in other situations, they're morally ambiguous and can even be seen as being in the right. This is because the word Satan isn't a proper name. It never shows up as a proper name in the Bible, with one possible exception, which we'll get to in a second here. The word Satan is typically rendered as accuser or someone who opposes something. So the enemy or the accuser is typically what the word Satan means. And this is why people who aren't identifiable with the Prince of Darkness can be described as standing in the role of a Satan. And like I said, the word itself is morally flexible. It can refer to evil people or it can refer to people acting in good ways. A great example of this is 1 Kings 11:14, where it refers to a malicious human referent. This isn't a supernatural figure, but they certainly are, if not evil, then in this case, at the very least, opposed to the protagonist of the story. Likewise, in Numbers 22:22, we do find a supernatural referent for this word. It's describing an angel, but it isn't describing an angel of darkness here. The figure called the Satan in Numbers 22:22 is the angel of the Lord itself, and it's called Satan because it's opposing the figure of Balaam, who is hostile to the protagonist of the story. So the term can refer to supernatural figures, but it can also refer to human figures, and it can refer to malicious figures, and it can refer to righteous figures as well. The term itself is a descriptor. It doesn't function as a proper name, and it's rather morally ambiguous. It can be used to denote evil, but it doesn't necessarily denote evil. Psalm 109 uses the word Satan in a way that suggests that it was a legal term, that this is taking place in something of a court setting, and that the Satan here is functioning as the court prosecutor, standing at the right hand of the accused. It's a minor detail, but remember the Satan standing at the right hand of the accused, as it's going to pop up later. There's no indication in Psalm 109 that this is a reference to a supernatural entity. Some have tried to read the text in this way and assume that the psalmist, perhaps David, is standing before God and Satan is accusing him there, the prince of darkness trying to bring a case against the righteous king. But we have to supply those details for the text. Psalm 109 doesn't seem to assume that the character of the Satan described here is a supernatural being. It seems that this is describing a court prosecutor in a human court system. And the idea of Satan referring to a court prosecutor actually fits really well with the next example of the Satan in the Old Testament, from the book of Job. In fact, this is the most famous appearance of Satan in the Old Testament because it's actually laid out in narrative form, which is rare for references to Satan in the Old Testament texts. Again, the figure of Satan in the book of Job has to be approached very carefully. A lot of us read this text with predispositions to understanding what Satan is, and we see this character as the Prince of Darkness, approaching the throne of God and asking permission to destroy the life of Job, God's righteous servant on earth. But if we look at the text in its own context, we see a little bit of a different characterization of the Satan figure pop up. The Satan figure in the book of Job is never shown to be evil. He never opposes God's plans. In fact, what he seems to be doing is pointing out the fact that, God, some of your servants only worship you because of the good things that you give them. This is one of the key themes of the book of Job, is Job's righteousness predicated on the fact that God has given him gifts. This is a very important question that a lot of us should ask ourselves today. But the point that the Satan is trying to make there is, hey, Job only worships you because of all the blessings you've given to him. Give me the power to take all of that away, and we'll see what Job is really made of here. While Job does suffer throughout this process, it doesn't seem that the Satan is trying to destroy Job's faith. Rather, he's functioning to test Job's faith. Furthermore, when the Satan is proven wrong by showing that Job does actually love God for his own sake, the Satan is never described as being punished or tormented as a result of his torture of a righteous man. He seems to be working in the court of God for God himself. And this has led most scholars to identify the Satan figure in Job not as the supernatural prince of darkness, but rather as the court prosecutor in the court of God itself. That's to say, the function of this Satan is to prosecute human beings, to take them before the court of God, and to show their weaknesses in the divine council. The word Satan is used for this figure because the Satan in Job functions as a divine parallel to the way a human Satan or a human prosecutor might. Just as a human Satan, a human prosecutor, might take a person before the court of a king and accuse them of something, so too does this cosmic court prosecutor take people before God and try their faith and try their cases against God. This is consistent with the only other time that the Satan figure shows up in the court of God, which is in the visions of Zechariah 3. In the visions of Zechariah 3, the Satan stands at the right hand, there's that right hand positioning again, of the high priest Joshua. Joshua appears dressed in dirty rags before the angel of the Lord, and the Satan figure is bringing accusations against Joshua. The Satan is rebuked, Joshua's dirty rags are taken away, and he's dressed in clean clothes, and this symbolizes Joshua's rehabilitation as the high priest of God and the fact that he's been cleansed of all of his sins. Now, the vision of Zechariah 3 and all of the dynamics of what's going on there is super complicated. Maybe we can do a video on that eventually. But suffice it to say that the Satan's accusations against Joshua here aren't actually wrong. Satan is approaching God saying, hey, Joshua is too unclean to do what you need him to do, to be the high priest. The high priest has to be ceremonially clean. And yet, here he is, Joshua is dressed in these filthy rags. He can't be the high priest of you. And the Satan in this situation is right. God's rebuke of the Satan isn't to say that this is a false report, but rather to say that God is going to make Joshua clean himself so that he can carry out his functions in the way that God intended for him to do so. So the Satan figure in Zechariah 3 isn't evil, he's actually correct, and he seems to be bringing the correct judgment of Joshua before God. God throws out the court case because he, as the divine judge, overrules it and makes exceptions to make Joshua into the figure that God needs him to be. It's also important to note that neither Job nor Zechariah 3 were designed with the intention of giving us a window into the divine court of God and telling us about the existence and operation of the divine court prosecutor. The visions of Zechariah 3 are very clearly described as apocalyptic visions and dreams. These are symbolic representations of things. The function of Zechariah 3 doesn't seem to be opening up a skylight into the divine realm to show us how things work there. Likewise, the book of Job has been debated as to its historicity for a very, very long time. Going back to the ancient church fathers and the ancient rabbis, a lot of the ancients considered the book of Job itself to be a parable, a very important parable and a parable containing truth, but a parable all the same. Among the church fathers, Theodore of Mopsuestia was the primary proponent of a parabolic understanding of the book of Job, and the opinions of several rabbis on the non-historicity of the book of Job are recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. All this is to say that the function of the book of Job, even if it is historical, isn't to give us a window into the operations of the divine realm. The focus is on Job. The focus is on the question of Job's righteousness and the reasons for which he worships God. Does he worship God because of all the blessings he receives, or does he worship God for God's own sake? That's the question being addressed here, not the dynamics of court politics in the throne room of God. The term Satan is used of a divine prosecutor one more time in the Bible in 1 Chronicles 21:1. Historically, church fathers and Christian history has seen this as a reference to the supernatural prince of darkness, but modern-day scholars have argued that this is actually better understood as the court prosecutor of God, bringing accurate charges against King David. As Ryan Stokes concludes, the Satan of 1 Chronicles 21:1 is an emissary of God carrying out Yahweh's punishment on Israel. The figure of the divine prosecutor actually has some parallels in ancient Mesopotamian literature. In the Neo-Babylonian period, there were court officials called the Marashu, whose function it was to live among the people and to report on them and bring accusations on citizens before the court of the king. The Marashu provide a very interesting analog that the idea of the Satan could have been based off of. If there were court officials who were living among human beings, going to and fro across the earth as it were, and who were reporting on human activities to the king, then it would be very easy to propose a spiritual equivalent of this, that the Satan figure was a divine auditor who was checking into the insights of all human beings and seeing what their relationship to God was really like. This also wouldn't be the first time that the roles of court bureaucrats were turned into names for obnoxious demons, as we have two other examples of this from ancient Mesopotamia. It seems that people have been turning lawyers into demons for well over 4,000 years at this point, so I guess some things just never change. These are all the major references to a divine figure called the Satan in the Old Testament itself. The other instances where the word or its related verb appear all have human references. But there are two other places that people typically look when they want information on Satan from the Old Testament: Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. So we'll break into those right now. The first thing that we should note is that neither of these texts, Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28, are particularly interested in the workings of the divine realm. Isaiah 14 is scolding the king of Babylon, and Ezekiel chapter 28 is a tirade against the king of Tyre. Neither of these seem to have a supernatural opponent in mind. They're designed to excoriate a very human king. That being said, from a very early period, ancient Christians decided to read this information as relating to the figure of Satan. This is where we get the idea of Satan being the morning star, from which the name Lucifer was derived in the Latin translations. These church fathers, like Origen of Alexandria, argue that these verses can't refer to actual human kings because no human king could ever be spoken of with such grandiose divinity. But unfortunately, Origen and others of his ilk underestimated the ego of ancient Near Eastern kings. For example, the Besetki statue of Naram Sin, dating to around 2200 BC, contains a list of the achievements of Emperor Naram Sin during his time as king and requests that he be inducted into the ranks of the gods themselves. Likewise, Israel's neighbors to the south in ancient Egypt considered their pharaohs to be fully divine even during their own reign here on earth. Israel's far northern neighbors, the Hittites, typically divinized kings after their death, but in at least one instance, the reign of Tudhaliya IV, the king was considered to be fully divine even during his own terrestrial reign. I could go on, but suffice it to say that in the ancient world in which Isaiah and Ezekiel were written, it really wasn't asking a whole lot for a king to describe themselves in either divine or semi-divine terms. So unfortunately, Origen was wrong about this one. It totally is acceptable, or at least reported, that ancient kings would speak of themselves in this way. Now that being said, not all Christians interpreted these texts as referring to the devil. Afrahat, a Persian Christian from around 330 AD, writes in his demonstrations regarding both of these texts, and in both of these texts he identifies them as referring to the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre respectively, with no mention of the devil or Satan showing up in his entire discussion of them. Some will argue that especially the tirade against the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28 has to refer to a spiritual entity because it uses the linguistic imagery of the Garden of Eden. As we saw earlier, the figure of Satan doesn't show up in the Garden of Eden story. This is a connection made only by people who assume that the serpent in the garden is indeed Satan. But even if the Garden of Eden imagery does show up in Ezekiel 28, which it demonstrably does, this doesn't necessarily mean that the figure being denounced here is the devil. First of all, using Garden of Eden imagery to refer to the king of Tyre is actually very appropriate. Tyre is located in modern-day Lebanon, and the cedar forests of Lebanon are likely the image that was used by the authors of Genesis to describe the Garden of Eden. Some argue that the figure here being denounced must be Satan because he's described as being a guardian cherub placed in the Garden of Eden. But unfortunately, the Hebrew text on this regard is ambiguous. It can be interpreted as meaning that he was placed there as a guardian cherub, as an anointed cherub, or that he was placed there with a guardian cherub, with an anointed cherub. The second option isn't just my preferred option for interpreting this text, it was also the preferred option of the Septuagint translators, the people who rendered the ancient Hebrew text of the Bible into Greek in antiquity. So it seems that, at least for these translators who spoke both Greek and Hebrew, and who lived substantially closer to the time of the Bible's composition, they understood this text as referring to the king of Tyre being placed in the Garden of Eden with a cherubim, not as a cherubim. Finally, Ezekiel 28:16 refers to the reason for the king of Tyre, or the figure being attacked here. It refers to the reason for their downfall being greed. The greed that is attacked here is inconsistent with the myth of Satan that we typically understand, where Satan fell because of pride or envy. In this particular situation, the figure being attacked fell because of their wealth and their trust in their own wealth, not because of their pride or their envy. Before we wrap up the exploration of Satan in the Old Testament, I want to talk a little bit more about the serpent in the Garden of Eden story, because as it turns out, in later retellings of this story, sometimes it was identified with the devil, but sometimes it wasn't. So the story of the Garden of Eden got told and retold many different times, and we have multiple different apocrypha that retell the Garden of Eden story with different twists on it. Sometimes these stories will include the idea that the devil was indeed the serpent in the garden. This shows up in the late Jewish apocalypse of Abraham. In other texts, on the other hand, we don't find the serpent showing up at all. This example can be found, for instance, in the book of Jubilees. Finally, in examples like the Greek apocalypse of Adam and Eve, the serpent and the devil both do occur in the Garden of Eden story, but they occur as separate entities. Satan hires the serpent to do his work for him, but he can't be identified with the serpent entirely. This goes to show that in the Second Temple period, the idea that Satan was the serpent in the garden wasn't firmly established. Some people were starting to move towards that interpretation, but other people held to different opinions. Not only one divergent opinion, but several. So it seems that the idea of Satan as the serpent in the garden was a relatively late development and wasn't there originally in the earliest interpretations of the text. So to summarize what we've discussed in the Old Testament so far, it appears that the supernatural prince of darkness that a lot of us remember from popular imaginations of the devil doesn't actually show up in the Old Testament. This isn't to say that evil is absent from the Old Testament text, however. Evil is very much present, but every time it shows up, it's human evil. Cain kills Abel. David kills Uriah the Hittite so that he can sleep with his wife. Every example of evil in the Old Testament comes from the heart of humankind, and that's the source of evil that the Old Testament is focused on taking care of. This comes as a surprise to many of us, but again, the theology of the Old Testament text wasn't dualistic. At least, not yet. We're going to see that in the Second Temple period, dualism became increasingly popular among apocalyptic thinkers, and this led to the characterization of evil not only as an abstract idea, as something that could be enacted by humans, but it was given a face and a name, or several names, I should say. Let's move on to discuss the texts of the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period took place after the reconstruction of the temple by the returning Israelites during the Persian period. This would be the 5th century BC, all the way to the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the late 1st century AD as well. So we're dealing with a long span of time here. This would be the span of time after the return of the Israelites from the Babylonian Empire, and throughout the Second Temple period, there would be different foreign invaders who would be ruling over the land known as Judea. These different foreign powers brought with them their own religious and political ideas, and this gave the inhabitants of Judea different ammunition and different ways of expressing their own theological ideas. So we see a lot of Persian influence and a lot of Greek influence in the way that the Israelites represented their philosophical and religious ideas. This isn't to say that the core of Jewish identity or of ancient Israelite theology was compromised by these ideas, but rather it gave them different ways of expressing how they could think about them. An older generation of scholars saw the figure of the devil appearing in Judaism as the importing of the idea from Persian religion. Persia ruled over Israel after the end of the Babylonian exile, as Persia defeated the Babylonian Empire and resettled the Judeans back in their homeland of Judea. This would have been the perfect time for Persian religion to seep into Jewish practices and for them to adopt certain ideas from Persian religion. But there's a couple reasons to believe that Persian religion didn't have as profound of an impact on Judaism as an older generation of scholars believed. First of all, as we'll see in a minute here, the idea of the Prince of Darkness seems to have evolved gradually throughout the Second Temple period. It doesn't appear fully formed at the beginning of it and deteriorate throughout, but rather there's a couple alternative competing models for the Prince of Darkness that grow more and more refined as the Second Temple period goes on. If the idea of the evil Prince of Darkness was imported wholesale from Persian religion, I think we would see a much more consistent picture than what we actually get. The other reason is because modern scholars are increasingly skeptical of what we can say about Persian religion from this very early period. Unfortunately, Persian sources on Persian religion are wanting in this time period. We don't see major theological works of Persian literature show up until a whole dynasty later in the Sasanian period. For context, it's about 600 or 700 years that we're waiting before we get written Zoroastrian texts. Now, we do get references in ancient Greek and some Babylonian sources on how the Persians and the Zoroastrians in particular saw their religious system. So we can confirm that they did have a dualistic system, and some of the key principles of their theology were already in place around the time of the Persian occupation of Judea. But that being said, we can't be very detailed on what exactly they believed and how much of an impact it might have had on ancient Israelite religion. Certainly there are some areas in the Bible and in some Second Temple texts where we see Persian ideas being used to represent Jewish theology and ancient Israelite theology. But at the same time, we have to be careful when pointing something out and saying, that's Persian, because again, the sources for this are very wanting. So we have to be very careful with that. With that being said, one of the main ideas that starts popping up and becoming increasingly popular throughout the Second Temple period is the idea of the Prince of Darkness, the ruler of this world who is opposed to the will of God and who has all of humankind in his grasp. This idea shows up rather early, but it shows up in a variety of manifestations. Even the name of this Prince of Darkness wasn't exactly established in the earliest period. So there's a couple different ways we could go about looking at how Second Temple texts speak about the Prince of Darkness. The way I'm going to do it is by looking at the different names for the Prince of Darkness and by putting together sort of a composite character of these different models for the Lord of the Dark, and I'm going to represent these one at a time for you here today. The earliest example of a Satan-like figure in the Second Temple period is Samyaza from the Book of Enoch. Although, as we'll see in a second here, the character of Samyaza is very different from the eventual character of Satan that we meet in later history. Samyaza, for anybody who hasn't read the Book of Enoch, was a watcher angel. He was part of a class of angel that was meant to watch over humankind and provide a sort of divine overwatch. When Samyaza and the Watchers looked down at humankind and saw that human women were very beautiful, they bound themselves together by a pact to descend to earth and to intermarry with humans and produce offspring of their own. In addition to bearing children, the Watchers also impart upon humankind the rules of civilization. They teach them how to build buildings, watch the stars, craft weapons and armor, and do elaborate metalsmithing works and techniques. So the Watcher story ends with the Watchers themselves being imprisoned by God and the archangels. The Watchers abandon their post, they exchange their cosmic immortality for the human immortality of having children, and as a result of their breach of the divine order, they were all imprisoned under the earth. Their offspring became the giants, the heroes of old, and were killed by the flood of Noah, their souls remaining on earth afterwards, caught between their earthly element and their divine element, stuck in a sort of limbo, and these became the demons that haunted human civilization ever since. So Semyaza isn't exactly the Prince of Darkness in the sense of a divine dark power who rules over the world. In fact, Semyaza and the Watchers are imprisoned at the end of the Book of Enoch. They don't appear to have a whole lot of influence on humankind. But that being said, according to the Book of Enoch itself, and thus according to the people who wrote it in the Second Temple period, the idea is that the Watchers are the originators and the exacerbators of evil upon the earth. The things that they taught humankind to do are the very things that later Judaism, even in the Old Testament itself, would condemn as being evil practices. So with Semyaza and the Watchers, we don't have a divine rebel or the Prince of Darkness, but we do have the idea of a cosmic origin of the root of all evil, which later infected all of humankind. In addition to that, we have something of a fallen angel story, although Semyaza willingly came down from heaven rather than being hurled out of it, as in the later stories of Satan. So we're starting to see some of the elements that would show up in the later Satan stories come to fruition, but the model isn't quite there yet. And again, this is the earliest stage, written around 250 BC, although the story is somewhat earlier than that. So let's keep going and see what other models of the Prince of Darkness showed up in this time period. Another evil angel that shows up in Second Temple literature is the figure of Azazel. The word Azazel does show up in the Old Testament, but there it's an abstract reference. It doesn't seem to refer to a devil or a demon. In the Second Temple period, however, the term Azazel was used as a name for a fallen angel. Specifically, in the Book of Enoch, Azazel is one of the Watchers who fell with Semyaza. Some scholars would contend that the Azazel story originated separately from the Semyaza story, and I personally follow that line of thinking as well, but in the present form we find that Azazel and the Semyaza story are combined together. Azazel descends with Semyaza and the other Watchers and is responsible for teaching humankind metallurgy and the art of making swords. Azazel is represented as a warmonger. He doesn't exactly beget evil, but he does give human beings the tools required for them to inflict evil upon each other. In later retellings of the story, Azazel became increasingly powerful. In fact, in the Apocalypse of Abraham, a late Second Temple Jewish work written about 350 years after the Book of Enoch was composed, we find Azazel as the name for the true Prince of Darkness. In this work, Azazel is the Lord of the Dark Powers and who rules over the shadowy realm of Earth as opposed to the light of God's realm. You know, honestly, Azazel does kind of deserve that promotion. Like 350 years, it's a long time to work to become the Prince of Darkness, but hey, he made it, so what can I say? It's also important to point out that Semyaza in the Watcher story is never represented as being the tempter of Adam and Eve. In fact, Adam and Eve never actually show up in the Book of Enoch or the Watcher story as a whole. And likewise, Azazel isn't shown to be the tempter of Adam and Eve in the Book of Enoch, but in that later document, the Apocalypse of Abraham, Azazel is referred to as being the tempter of Adam and Eve. So with Azazel, at least in the later manifestations of his story, we actually have two of the key elements of the Satan story. We have the idea of the tempter of Adam and Eve, and we also have the idea that this is the Prince of Darkness ruling over the world. If the Apocalypse of Abraham assumes the Watcher origin for Azazel from the Book of Enoch, then we could even include there the idea that this is a fallen angel. So three of the key points of the Satan story are present in the Second Temple period from different pieces of literature about the same character called Azazel. A less popular, but substantially, I would say, more important figure that's described as the Prince of Darkness in some Second Temple texts is the figure of Mastema. Mastema primarily shows up in the Book of Jubilees, but he does show up elsewhere in certain Dead Sea Scrolls as well. Mastema is an ancient Hebrew word that simply means opposition. It shows up twice in the Book of Hosea, and in neither situation is it used to refer to a demon or a devil. It seems that when the Prince of Darkness was put together by the author of Jubilees, they thought that a really good name for this abstract idea of evil, which was given a face here, would be Mastema, taking the word opposition and using it as the name for the Prince of Darkness in the story. It's also worth noting that the word Mastema is actually a byword for the word Satan. You'll recall that Satan means opposer, accuser, or hostility, and Mastema is something of a synonym for it. On top of that, the root word of mastema is stm, using the consonantal text. Likewise, the consonantal text of Satan is stn, so it's a very closely related word and is something of a synonym for the term Satan. On top of that, mastema in the Book of Jubilees is actually referred to as the Satan, the opposer, the accuser, in at least one place. Like I said a second ago, mastema is the primary antagonist of the Book of Jubilees, but he may show up in a couple other documents as well. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a very important document recovered there was something called the Damascus document. Mastema may make an appearance here, but unfortunately it's uncertain as to whether this is meant to be a reference to the angel Mastema or the angel of opposition, the opposing angel. The language used in this document is unclear, so Mastema may make an appearance as a named figure in the Damascus document, but it may simply be a reference to the angel of opposition, which may or may not be a reference to Mastema. Other Dead Sea Scrolls use the word mastema as a parallel to their preferred reference for the Prince of Darkness, Belial, which we'll get to in just a moment. And in yet other entries in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the plural of angels of mastema, or angels of opposition, are used to refer to a class of fallen angels. Now, Mastema's role in the Book of Jubilees is to serve as the Prince of Darkness. The world is a dark place controlled by dark powers, and Mastema is the prince of those powers. That being said, Mastema's origins aren't described in similar ways to the origins of Satan in the common story that we're familiar with here. The Book of Jubilees doesn't offer a narrative explanation for how Mastema came to his position as the Prince of Darkness on Earth, but what little references do exist seem to suggest that God actually created him to be the great opponent. Whether he intended for him to be the opponent of God or of human beings is a little bit ambiguous. Sometimes he's both. But what is really interesting is that when Mastema carries out evil on Earth, he doesn't seem to be, with the devil was originally good, and then he became evil due to his own free will. But when Mastema does evil, he's actually carrying out his original function. He was designed to be the great opponent of humankind. And that's a very interesting theological question to wrestle with. Fortunately, the Book of Jubilees doesn't show up in the Bible, so that's not something that we Christians have to worry about. But it is a very interesting way of understanding the Prince of Darkness. When Mastema carries out evil things, he isn't malfunctioning. He's still operating within the sphere of God's control and of God's plan for creation. Apparently, for humankind to flourish, they needed something of an opposite or an enemy to do combat with, and that's the function of Mastema. Even so, Mastema isn't the tempter of Adam and Eve in the garden. It simply says that the serpent does this, but there's no reference to the serpent either being Mastema or being in league with Mastema. In fact, Mastema's origins are actually closer to the Watcher myth than they are to the Adam and Eve story. The Book of Jubilees is unique in taking both the Adam and Eve story and the Watcher story as two different examples of how evil entered into the world, one by human decision and one by cosmic decision. Mastema doesn't really get involved in the human decision. Adam and Eve make that decision all by themselves. But when it comes to the fall of the Watchers, the story plays out almost exactly as it does in the Book of Enoch. The big difference in the retelling of this story in the Book of Jubilees is that as God was locking the Watchers beneath the earth, Mastema approaches him and says, hey, if you want me to play the bad guy, if you want me to be the Prince of Darkness, I need some cronies. I would like to have 1/10 of the Watchers to be my henchmen here on earth. And God agrees. In order for Mastema to carry out his purpose, he does need a legion of the Dark Ones. So this is the origin of fallen angels and spirits entering into the host of the Prince of Darkness in the Book of Jubilees. For as really interesting of a character as Mastema is, he really doesn't show up a whole lot outside of the Book of Jubilees. Like I said, the only other time I was able to find reference to him was in certain Dead Sea Scrolls. But as I mentioned earlier, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls had another name they used for the Prince of Darkness, Belial. Belial is actually a Hebrew term. It shows up in the Old Testament, but like Mastema, it's never used as a descriptor for a demon or a devil. The word Belial simply means wickedness in abstract Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in contrast to the Old Testament and much of the New Testament, is hotly dualistic. And so when it portrays the Prince of Darkness, it portrays the Prince of Darkness as being on the opposite end of the pole from God. God controls the angels of light and the spirit of truth, whereas the Prince of Darkness controls the angels of darkness and the spirit of falsehood. The Prince of Darkness in the Dead Sea Scrolls rules over the world. He enters into the heart of every human being, and he engages in spiritual warfare outside of the realm of human beings with the angels of God, attempting to stop the angels from helping humankind. Likewise, the spirit of falsehood, which issues from Belial, wrestles over control of every human being, while the spirit of truth from God wrestles against it. And thus, every human being has the opportunity to believe in truth or falsehood, whether they walk in the way of Belial or in the way of God. Belial was also seen as being behind the political machinations of nations that were hostile to the Jewish people and to the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls specifically. For instance, when the Romans invaded Judea, they were seen as being the men of Belial, men under Belial's control, whereas the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, that community, were seen as the sons of light, whom Belial was attempting to stamp out. Well, Belial was the preferred name for the Prince of Darkness by the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. It doesn't seem to have been restricted to this. The Apostle Paul seems to know the name Belial as the name of a demonic power in 2 Corinthians 6:15, and in an early Jewish Christian document called the Ascension of Isaiah, Belial is the preferred term for the Prince of Darkness in that text as well. So it seems that this was a name for the Prince of Darkness that was used by a lot of different people in this time frame, but the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular really like to use this name as the Prince of Darkness. I said a second ago as well that Mastema is likewise used as a synonym for Belial. So whatever people believed about Mastema, those beliefs seem to have been melded with views about Belial in certain of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Another name for the Prince of Darkness that appears uncommonly in ancient texts is Belkaira. Now, I was looking for the etymology of this word, and I wasn't having a whole lot of luck, but the more I looked into it, I actually put together my own model. So what I'm going to recommend here is an educated guess. It could be wrong, there could be resources out there on this, but I wasn't able to find or access those, so this is my best shot. For a long time, we only had access to the name Belkaira through translated texts. So texts that originated in Hebrew but were translated into Greek, and then the Hebrew originals were lost. So when we encountered the name Belkaira, we encountered it in Greek texts. But the rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls meant that we could access earlier Hebrew forms of this name. And as it turns out, the original form of the name Belkaira was actually Melchiresha. The name Melchiresha is actually relatively easy to interpret. Melech is the Hebrew word for king, and Melchi refers to the fact that either I am king or my king, if it's functioning possessively. The word Resha or Rasha is the Hebrew word for wickedness, or at least one of them. So Melchiresha, the Hebrew word, seems to mean something like I am the king of wickedness. I mentioned a second ago that the Hebrew word for wickedness? I mentioned a second ago that the Hebrew word for wickedness is Rasha, but this is only one of the many words for wickedness or evil in Hebrew. Another very commonly used word is Ra. So if Ra was substituted for Rasha in the name Melchiresha, we arrive at the name Melchi-Ra, which sounds quite a bit like Belkaira. And the connection can be established even more firmly when we consider the fact that the letter M and the letter B are both bilabial sounds. This is to say, you make both of these sounds with the same part of your mouth in the same motion. Ma and ba are very similar sounds, and we see a lot in ancient languages where two similar sounds over time start to become conflated or even swap out with one another. A great example of this is the word for gold, which in Hebrew is zahav, but in Aramaic is dahav. The sound za and the sound da are very close to one another, and as the two languages split, za gave way to da. Zahav became dahav. I would suggest something similar happened here with the name Melchira, which became Belkira over time. And so we go from Melchiresha to Melchi-Ra to Belkira. It's entirely possible there's a whole other etymological origin to this name, but again, if there is, I haven't been able to find it. So I would suggest that the name Belkaira or Melchiresha means I am king of evil, or I am king of wickedness. Now, all that being said, there's actually not a whole lot to say about Belkaira, because like I said, he only shows up a couple of times. He shows up in some late ancient Jewish Christian texts as a reference to the ruler of the evil world, and he does show up in a couple of texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, like 4Q Amram. In that particular text I just mentioned, 4Q Amram, Belkaira is described as having an adder-like appearance, a serpent-like appearance. So this may be a suggestion that at some point Belkaira and the serpent of Genesis 3 were co-identified, but it could also be the fact that serpents were sometimes seen as signs of danger and even wickedness in ancient Israel. That doesn't seem to be the idea with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, at least not specifically, but it's possible that at later times all the symbolism of these different things were conflated together. So Belkaira may or may not be associated with the serpent of Genesis 3 in this text, but one way or another, he is represented as being the Prince of Darkness on parallel to Mastema. And finally, we arrive at Satan himself. You'll notice that the word Satan hasn't been used for a little while, but as it turns out, in the Second Temple period, the word Satan increasingly began to be used to refer to the Prince of Darkness. Now remember that in the Old Testament period, the figure of Satan doesn't appear to be evil, much less the Prince of Darkness. But in the Second Temple period, as people told more and more stories about the Prince of Darkness, they increasingly identified the Satan of the Old Testament with an evil figure which rules over the world as the Prince of Darkness. This comes out most strongly in a text written around 100 BC in Jewish Alexandria called the Testament of Job. The Testament of Job is a legendary expansion of the book of Job. It adds on to the story that we find in the Old Testament and gives legendary accretions for the personality of Job, his relationship with his family, and stories about how Satan came to destroy everything that Job had. In the Testament of Job, we find the character of Satan from the Old Testament has been expanded. No longer is he the court prosecutor of God, but he's the evil prince of the world. The figure of Satan in the Testament of Job is a tempter. He tempts Job and he tempts the people around Job to do evil things. And so we find, if not direct comparison with the serpent of Adam and Eve, we nevertheless find a similar role of the tempter being applied to Satan here. Likewise, Satan is understood by the Testament of Job's author to be the Prince of Darkness who's ruling over the world and is opposed to God. Around the same time as the Testament of Job, a book called The Wisdom of Solomon makes a throwaway reference to the devil, which is nevertheless very interesting, because at some point, the Wisdom of Solomon says that evil entered into the world owing to the devil's envy. Unfortunately, we don't have a story here for what the devil did, but it is interesting that while the Wisdom of Solomon acknowledges that evil entered into the world because of a figure called the devil, it isn't pride that's said to be the prime sin of the devil. Rather, envy is. We'll get into this more later, but just keep in mind that at least at some points in the early stages, it wasn't pride, but envy that was associated with Satan. Perhaps the most important ancient Second Temple text to talk about the figure of Satan is something called the Life of Adam and Eve. This is a fictional biography of Adam and Eve composed sometime in the Second Temple period, probably closer to the latter end of it, and it survives in Greek manuscripts and Latin manuscripts. Fortunately, these two manuscript traditions disagree with each other on the order and the contents of the biography of Adam and Eve, and so as a result, we're not 100% sure which of these elements are original to the Second Temple period and which of these are later additions made sometime in the Christian period. Nevertheless, the best manuscript tradition, being the Greek Apocalypse of Adam and Eve, does contain references to a story about the interaction between Satan and Adam. In this story, God creates a humanoid form out of clay on earth and calls it Adam. Before breathing life into it, it's simply standing there inert. All the angels gather around the clay Adam and are ordered by Michael, the archangel, to worship it because it's an image of God himself, this being a reference to the fact that humankind is the image of God. Satan, however, refuses to worship the image of God. He says that Adam was created after himself, and so Adam should worship Satan instead of the other way around. Michael reminds him, like, hey, this is the image of God, you better do this, and Satan again refuses. The result is Satan's excommunication and the fall of the fallen angels. This story may be the origin of the comment in The Wisdom of Solomon that the devil's envy is what brought evil into the world, but one way or another, it's interesting to find that in the early period, it wasn't necessarily pride that was associated with Satan so much as it was envy for humankind's part in the world. And in fact, this idea would actually continue well into the early Christian period before eventually being stamped out in favor of the pride model. Another Second Temple text called Third Baruch, this one dating to the later end of the Second Temple period, does refer to the figure of Satan being the tempter of Adam and Eve, although the serpent itself is never mentioned. So it's unclear if it's referring to the story of the Garden of Eden or if it's referring to something else, although a reference to the Garden of Eden does seem probable. This survey of Second Temple literature reveals a couple of key insights. First of all, although the idea of the Prince of Darkness doesn't show up in the pre-exilic texts of the Old Testament, after the Babylonian exile during the Second Temple period, the concept of the Prince of Darkness as the ruler of this dark world became increasingly popular. That being said, although this was a very popular idea, the images and the backgrounds of the Prince of Darkness were disparate and disorganized. There was never one consistent story of the Prince of Darkness, but rather many different attempts at explaining the origin of evil. That's also a key point that I think is worth capitalizing on. A lot of these stories and depictions of the Prince of Darkness were attempts at explaining the manifestations of evil as they were experienced in the world today. You'll recall that among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial was believed to be behind the forces of the Kittim. these invading, colonizing Romans who were pushing into Judean territory and causing mass havoc and destruction on the way. Likewise, in the Watcher narrative of the Book of Enoch, all the implements by which humankind causes trouble for itself are seen as having their origins with the fallen angels, the Watchers, who brought down the arts of civilization and lessons in warfare, astrology, and temptation with them so that humankind could harass one another with those gifts. All of these things are attempts at explaining the origins of evil. How exactly did evil enter into the world, and how do we deal with it today? So although representations of the Prince of Darkness had disparate manifestations in Second Temple literature, nevertheless they were almost entirely caught up with the question of the presence of evil, its reality, how we deal with it today, and what its ultimate destination will be when God comes to judge humankind. Now that we've perused the Second Temple period, I think it's a good idea to check in on the New Testament itself. The New Testament depicts events that took place during the Second Temple period. And as a result, we're going to see a lot of continuity between the way Second Temple people thought and the way that the authors of the New Testament thought. So let's take a look at the figure of Satan as he appears in the New Testament of the Bible. I'm going to start with the most dualistically inspired of the New Testament writings, that being the Gospel of John. For anybody wondering, in grad school, I was going to be a Johannine specialist in my PhD program before I decided to change tracks on that. So I have a very great interest in the Gospel of John, and I find its theology utterly fascinating. One of the elements of Johannine theology is the concept of the darkness of this world and the prince of this world, who is identified as the devil or Satan. In the Gospel of John, Satan rules the world and is opposed to Jesus, but he actually doesn't make an appearance as a person. When Satan acts, he acts through people. He incites religious leaders to oppose the ministry of Jesus, and at the climactic element of the Last Supper, enters into Judas and causes him to betray Jesus over to his death at the hands of the Romans. So although John is thoroughly dualistic and understands Satan to be the prince of darkness, he nevertheless understands Satan to operate through human beings. He operates through religious leaders who are too blinded by their own spiritual cowardice to actually believe in the person of Jesus. And likewise, Satan acts through the person of Judas in order to oppose Jesus in a more direct manner. But never does Satan actually manifest himself as a person or even a visible spirit in order to oppose Jesus. He always remains in the ether as an almost abstract concept of evil, even though human beings are inspired by him to cause evil against Jesus. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see interactions between Jesus and evil spirits show up quite frequently. Now, I'm going to save discussion of demons for another video. It's almost like this is part of a 4-part series, and the logical conclusion after talking about Satan is talking about demons. That's foreshadowing, by the way. But for the time being, suffice it to say that when Jesus is casting out demons, the effect is less that Jesus is actually working on this or that particular demon. The fact is that Jesus, like with his healing miracles, is showing that the power of darkness in the world is being broken by the power of light. The kingdom of God has come upon all of humankind, and an element of that is the healing of diseases and the casting out of demons. So the casting out of demons in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is less about Jesus' victory over this or that evil spirit, and more about the fact that the kingdom of God has come, and the kingdom of darkness will at last be broken. That being said, there are a few places in the Synoptic Gospels that warrant specific comment. For example, in Luke 10:18, Jesus states, "I saw Satan fall from heaven like a lightning bolt." This has been taken by a lot of theologians and even some scholars to refer to the idea that Jesus was there during the primordial rebellion of Satan. When Satan raised himself up against God and was cast down to earth, Jesus was there and he saw this. But the context of what Jesus is saying here makes this an unlikely explanation. Jesus is just receiving word from his disciples that they too had the ability to cast out demons. Jesus had sent these disciples out to the far reaches of the land, and they were coming back saying, "Even the demons submit to us. We're able to do miracles in your name." That's the point at which Jesus says, "I've seen Satan fall like lightning from heaven." The context suggests that Jesus isn't saying abstractly, "Hey, that's cool. By the way, I was back then in that time when Satan fell from heaven because I was always around and I was back then." That's not the point Jesus is trying to make here. Jesus is trying to say that Satan, the enthroned prince of darkness ruling from the powers of the air, has been cast down. The kingdom of God has come upon humankind, and the disciples are able to carry out Jesus' work even outside of his own presence. Another text worth commenting on is in Mark 8 and its parallels in Matthew and Luke, and this is where Jesus tells the disciples that it's necessary for him to go to his death and be crucified. The response to this is that Peter tries to talk Jesus out from this, at which point Jesus responds by saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, it's really impressive that Jesus isn't talking about Judas here. He isn't talking about the Pharisees here. He's talking about Peter, his right-hand man, the leader of the disciples in a lot of ancient texts. So we see that Peter is carrying out the role of Satan, or even the will of Satan, by opposing Jesus. Even somebody as close to Jesus as Peter is capable of doing this, because Satan is capable of working on the heart of anybody. The devil is mentioned a couple of different times in the letters of the apostles preserved in the New Testament. For example, James 4:7 contains the pithy saying that you should resist the devil and he will flee from you. This saying shows up as well in 1 Peter 5:8. Although in 1 Peter, the saying is expanded to say that the devil is roaming around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Neither of these situations are designed to give us an insight into the order of the divine realm. Rather, they're saying that evil is looking for you, and if you're not careful, it will sweep you up. You ought to resist the evil without you in the world itself, but also the evil that attempts to creep its way into your heart. This is especially fitting for the book of James, which is almost entirely predicated on the mindset and the spiritual perspective that a Christian should have. So 1 Peter and James seem to be unuseful if we're looking for data about the figure of Satan himself. 2 Peter 2:4 states that God did not forgive the angels who abandoned their positions, but rather locked them in chains of gloomy darkness. This is taken by a lot of people to refer to the fallen angels who fell alongside Satan during his divine conspiracy, but it's worth noting that Peter here is actually drawing from the Watcher myth. Chains of darkness are a very specific reference to the story of the Watchers and their imprisonment beneath the earth. And the concept of fallen angels being imprisoned under the earth likewise shows up specifically in the Watcher story, and this seems to be the thing that 2 Peter is drawing from here. Likewise, Peter, again, isn't trying to give us insight into the divine realm. In the scope of 2 Peter, what he's talking about is the fact that there are false teachers out there that God is going to judge. 2 Peter is written to a community which is being oppressed by false teachers who are teaching things that are not true. And Peter is writing this epistle to remind the people that, hey, God didn't just, let the fallen angels who fell at this time go on with their way. He punished them. Likewise, during the time of Noah, God didn't just forgive the wickedness of all the people who insisted on living in sin, but punished them. Likewise, in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, these people were just living in abject immorality, and so God punished them as well. So Peter isn't making an abstract theological declaration that there are fallen angels kept in chains of darkness. He's referring to these stories to support his point that's saying, hey, God is going to punish the evildoers, like the false prophets who are causing trouble for you guys. So I think looking to 2 Peter 2:4 for information on the role of divine fallen rebels and their current imprisonment would be a little bit wrong-headed as well. A similar situation shows up in Jude verse 9. In this verse, Jude refers to a story where Satan and the archangel Michael are wrestling over the body of Moses. If you're looking for this story in the Old Testament or anywhere else in the Bible, you're not going to find it. Apparently, this story owes its origins to an apocryphon called the Apocalypse of Moses. This part of the apocryphon isn't preserved, but fortunately, Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century had read this story and also read Jude, and says, oh, well, this is where that story comes from. Now again, what Jude is doing by citing this story isn't saying that this story actually took place or that this story is true. Rather, he's drawing from various stories to make a point to the people that he's writing to. This particular point is similar to the one in 2 Peter. There are false teachers going around speaking things that they shouldn't. And so Jude is using the example of the devil in this particular story found in the Apocalypse of Moses, as well as other examples from the biblical texts to say that, hey, just like these things came to be and were punished, so too will these false teachers who are speaking improperly in your own midst. Both 2 Peter and the book of Jude are drawing from non-canonical sources, but they're not either saying, A, that these are actual things that actually happened, or B, that these books should be in the Bible or something of that nature. Rather, what they're doing is taking stories that the audience is probably familiar with and using them to support the things that they're saying. Hey, you have false teachers among you now? Well, here is a dozen different examples from scripture, from popular culture, of false teachers coming under God's judgment and being judged eventually, if not now, then on the last day. And so, like in 2 Peter, I don't think it would be a good idea to look to Jude 9 for information on the divine realm. A similar situation confronts us with 2 Corinthians 11:14. This is the famous verse that says that Satan appears as an angel of light. A lot of commentators over the years have taken this to be a theological statement, suggesting that sometimes Satan does appear, and when he does, he manifests himself as an angel of light. I've actually seen a diehard Protestant try to deploy this verse against a Catholic who, on his deathbed, says he saw an angel of light appear to him. The diehard Protestant I'm referring to quoted this verse saying that Satan himself sometimes appears as an angel of light to suggest that this Catholic on his deathbed had actually been visited by the devil and was going to hell after he died. But that's not the point Paul is trying to make with this verse. Paul isn't making a theological statement about the nature of Satan with this verse. Again, looking at the context of this passage, Paul is warning the Corinthians against false teachers. And so when he says that Satan himself appears as an angel of light, this is a way of saying that, hey, false teachers can appear as good teachers. Wolves can appear as sheep. Bad people can appear as good people. And we see bad people appearing as good people all the time, as many scandals in the church, both Catholic and Protestant, in recent decades can prove to us. Not only is Paul not making a theological statement about the nature of Satan in this verse, I think that if we ignore what Paul is actually saying here, we're doing that to our own detriment. We need to recognize false teachers and selfish teachers and corrupt leadership wherever it manifests itself. This is a situation where Satan is representing himself as an angel of light. While we're on the topic of Paul, it's worth noting that Paul really doesn't have a whole lot to say about the figure of Satan himself. Paul does refer to powers of darkness and control over the human world, which fits in line with what we've seen from the Second Temple period. But in Paul's outline of his own theology in the book of Romans, the character of Satan really doesn't play a substantial role in it. In fact, he doesn't appear until the very end, where Paul references Satan almost offhandedly in Romans 16. So while Paul does acknowledge the existence of evil powers which seek to suppress the spread of the gospel, and while he does refer to the figure of Satan in minor references elsewhere, it doesn't seem that a deep diabology, a theology of the devil, is an intricate part of his theological construct. Now, the figure of the devil also features prominently in the book of Revelation, particularly in those sections referring to the dragon, or the red dragon in heaven. But we should be very careful when we approach the figure of the devil, or any other figure for that matter, in the book of Revelation, because in Revelation we have in our hands a book of visions. This isn't to say that there is no reality behind the visions being depicted in Revelation, but they are visions all the same. These are symbolic enactments of very real things that are taking place in the world. A great example of the relationship between visions and what's going on in the human world can be found in the other apocalyptic book in the Bible, the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, we find examples of terrifying beasts being depicted in the visions, which clash with one another and which are ultimately revealed to be representations for the political nations of humankind on earth itself. So the visions are dramatized visual representations of things that are taking place currently in human history. This isn't necessarily the only thing that visions can mean, and speaking about Revelation in general terms is always a way to get into trouble, but we should be cautious when we explore the figure of Satan in the book of Revelation, because we are dealing with a book of visions. I'm going to treat the character of the dragon and the dragon cycle of Revelation separately in its own video, which is going to come out at some point, hopefully sometime this year still. So we'll put that to the side for the time being. Suffice it to say that the devil does show up in the book of Revelation, but in at least one place, he seems to show up rather abstractly. At the end of Revelation, after Christ has returned, vanquished evil, and the kingdom of God is fulfilled upon earth, death and the devil are both thrown into the lake of fire. So here we find that the devil is represented as a person and as a figure, but likewise death is as well. And so it's difficult to say if Satan is meant here to refer to an actual person, or if this is a symbolic manifestation of evil in the vision, similar to how death is a symbolic manifestation of death in this section. So it's difficult to make a statement one way or the other. Our survey of the New Testament text regarding the devil shows us that there is no concrete systematic theology of Satan being offered by the New Testament itself. When Satan does act on the stage, he does so through human beings. It's human beings carrying out evil that we find manifesting evil itself in the story of the New Testament. It appears that the character of Satan, who is already absent from the Old Testament, remains a nebulous force even in the New Testament, remaining in a more abstract state even than we find him in many of the Second Temple Jewish texts. In any case, the theology of the devil is substantially less concrete and less influential than a lot of us typically assume it to be. While the devil is present in the text of the New Testament, he isn't a primary actor or a major piece of theology. If anything, he's an obstacle that needs to be removed. The incarnation of all evil acting through human beings to affect evil into the world. The early Christian texts were written during the context of Second Temple Judaism, and as they were all written by Second Temple Jews, they reflect the worldview that Second Temple Jews would have had. But as the church became increasingly popular with Gentiles, we suddenly have non-Jews entering into the Christian fold and applying their interpretation to the Second Temple doctrines and building them out more. This is where we see the more concrete picture of Satan as we all know him today begin to manifest. That being said, not even in the early centuries of the Christian church do we find a uniform and consistent story or model of Satan being offered. It was still a gradual process from the beginning of Christianity to arrive at the portrait of Satan that we all understand today. But that portrait began to be painted from the very earliest times, using pieces of Second Temple theology, bits of reinterpreted Old Testament, and above all, the New Testament itself. The worldview of Second Temple Judaism, the dualism that posits evil angels as opposed to angels of light, and their prince as opposed to the power of light in God, was taken up by many early Christian writings. First Clement, Ignatius of Antioch, and the Epistle of Pseudo-Barnabas, three of the earliest Christian writings ever recorded, all attest that this is the worldview that these Gentile Jewish Christians maintained as they went into the early years of Christianity. But this cosmic dualism actually wasn't absolute. There were examples of early Christians who took a more abstract expression of evil. The Shepherd of Hermas, for instance, perhaps written as early as 90 AD or as late as 150 AD, doesn't seem particularly interested by the existence of the Prince of Darkness or a host of evil angels. Rather, good and evil are played out in the human heart itself, and it's the human being which is the centerpiece for decisions that were to be made in the world, either for good or for evil. This isn't to say that the Shepherd of Hermas denied the existence of the Prince of Darkness or of good and evil angels, but if he did acknowledge them, he doesn't in the copious chapters of this work. It's also worth noting that the Shepherd of Hermas is a visionary work. It is a book of visions, much like the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel, and yet Hermas always keeps the focus on the human being itself, very rarely talking about things outside of the human mind and the human soul. So it's actually very interesting that Hermas's focus is almost entirely on the dualism that affects the human being rather than on cosmic dualism, given the genre he's writing in. When early Christian intellectuals began laying the foundation for the story of Satan as we all know it today, they began by combining a couple of different stories and a couple of different elements. A key one of these is the Watcher narrative, which was combined by a lot of early Christians with the story of the temptation of Adam and Eve. So for instance, Papias of Hierapolis, who wrote around 125 AD and is best known for collecting early traditions of the church generation prior to his own, Papias represents the fallen angels as being originally established by God to be rulers over the nations of the world. These angels were led astray by the serpent, who is identified as Satan, and Satan would be disarmed by Jesus upon his resurrection and ultimately defeated by God at the second coming of Christ. So already here with Papias, we're seeing the early stages of the Satan myth that a lot of us know today. Likewise, Justin Martyr, writing as early as 150 or as late as the 160s AD, identified the Watcher myth and the traditional fall of Satan as being two elements of the same story. The Watchers were originally angels of God, but they were tempted to fall by Satan, whom Justin identifies with the serpent from the Adam and Eve story. As we've seen so far, the Watcher myth from the Book of Enoch was hugely influential on how the ancient Christian church thought about the character of Satan and his demons. But not everybody relied heavily on the Watcher myth. Justin Martyr's heretical studentation of Assyria identified the fallen angels as demons and said that the gods of the various nations of the world were likewise to be identified with these demon fallen angels. Tatian even goes so far as to say that the head of the fallen angels, Satan, is to be identified with the figure of Zeus, who is the leader of the Greek Olympians and thus the king of the gods in the world that Tatian inhabited. But despite Tatian's rejection of the Watcher myth, it remained in popular commerce elsewhere in Christianity. Around the same time as Tatian, in 177 AD, Athenagoras of Athens wrote his own literature. And in this literature, Athenagoras identifies Satan as a fallen angel and identifies him with part of the Watcher story. That being said, Athenagoras does introduce a new element which would become very key in the story of Satan as we all know it today, that being the emphasis on free will. Athenagoras was the first one to emphasize the fact that Satan's fall was caused by his own volition. Satan, unlike Mastema of Jubilees, wasn't created evil. He had the opportunity to remain in God's good graces like the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, but he willfully chose to go against God's plan and set himself up as his own ruler. Theophilus of Antioch wrote around 180 AD in western Syria, in Antioch. Theophilus is really interesting because he begins to refer to Satan as a fallen angel, but doesn't seem to refer explicitly to the Watcher myth. So we're starting to see the Watcher myth itself give way to the theory of the fallen angels. Originally, it seems that the Watcher myth is what spawned the theory of Satan as a fallen angel, with his own cohort of fallen angels being related to the Watchers. But now we're starting to see the suppression of the Watcher myth and the birth of a new myth derived from it with the fallen angel story. Theophilus of Antioch follows some Second Temple Jewish thinking by separating Satan from the serpent. Theophilus nevertheless identifies the serpent as Satan's lackey, who is convinced by Satan to tempt Adam and Eve. So, although Satan and the serpent aren't co-identified, they do work in tandem. Likewise, Theophilus also opted for the envy model of Satan's fall. Rather than Satan falling because of pride, he fell out of envy for God's favor for Adam and Eve, following the wisdom of Solomon and the apocalypse of Adam story from earlier in this video. Similar to Theophilus of Antioch was Irenaeus of Lyon, who began his career in modern-day Turkey and ended it in modern-day France, back then known as Asia Minor and Gaul, respectively. Like Theophilus, Irenaeus adopted the fallen angel model for the fall of Satan and doesn't show much signs of being affected by the core Watcher story. And also like Theophilus, Irenaeus likewise adheres to the envy model of the fall of Satan rather than the pride model. Although as we see, we're going to start seeing the pride model picking up a lot more steam in the near future after Irenaeus. Shortly after Irenaeus, around 210 AD in North Africa, the ancient city of Carthage, we meet the Christian theologian Tertullian. Tertullian was interesting because he was one of the last Christian theologians who held the Book of Enoch to be canonical. He wanted it to be included in the Bible. And so it's not all that surprising to find that Tertullian believed in two falls. First, Satan rebelled against God, and later Satan tempted the Watchers to fall after him, thus following with models proposed by Papias and Justin Martyr. The fact that the Watcher myth was increasingly falling out of favor with the church is demonstrable in the fact that a generation after Tertullian, Cyprian of Carthage, who was generally a massive fan of Tertullian's writings, writes about the devil with no mention of the Watcher myth, instead increasing his focus on the myth of the rebellion of the angels against God, which would become embedded in the later Satan story. Around the same time, about 190 AD in Roman-occupied Egypt, Clement of Alexandria likewise held to the fallen angel model of Satan. He doesn't seem to show any reliance on the Book of Enoch's Watcher story. And interestingly, Clement of Alexandria is also the first person to introduce the privation theory of evil. This is going to come up a lot later in this video, but what's interesting is that the privation theory is the idea that evil isn't exactly a thing in and of itself. Rather, it's understood to be the absence of good. This would have a profound impact on the history of Christian interpretation of evil and the question of evil and the devil altogether. This began with Clement of Alexandria. But it would be Clement's famous and infamous student Origen of Alexandria who would have a more profound influence on the way that Satan is viewed in ancient Christianity. Origen's view on evil is, like most things, very idiosyncratic and very complicated. But suffice it to say that Origen focused on the fallen angel story with decreased emphasis on the Watcher myth, and was also one of the early Christians to identify Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as referring to a cosmic figure. Again, Origen's incredulity that a human king could speak about themselves in this way is at the root of his identification of these texts with a demonic being. And as we'll see, Origen's influence and the influence of others like him would have a profound impact on the future of Christian diabology. It's also worth noting that with Origen onwards, the church and the ancient Christians increasingly identified the sin of the devil as pride rather than envy. And so the envy model offered by many ancient Christians like Irenaeus and Theophilus fell to the wayside largely and was replaced with the idea that Satan in his pride wanted to be lifted up higher than God. And again, this is emboldened by Origen's interpretation of Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 here. So this isn't the origin of that idea, but this is a major line of support for that idea. And from Origen's time onward, we start to see more and more Christians adopting the pride model as opposed to the envy model. Going into the theology of Satan of individual church fathers after this point becomes a little bit redundant, because after this early period, we start to see a more formalized picture of the story of Satan take place. Satan was a fallen angel who rebelled against God because of his pride. The fallen angel model and the pride model were the two key forms of the Satan story which would replace the envy model and the Watcher model. This gets us the first glimpses at the figure of Satan as he was understood by the church from this very early period onwards. It was at this point, around the 3rd and 4th centuries, that the picture of the devil in early Christianity really begins to crystallize, and it would maintain that crystallized form well into the modern period. I do want to especially mention, however, one very important theologian in the person of St. Augustine. Augustine, or Augustine, was the most influential Christian theologian, at least in the Latin West, in perhaps all of Christian history. And Augustine followed Clement of Alexandria in identifying the presence of evil as being the absence of good. Like Clement, Augustine didn't believe that evil was a thing in and of itself, but rather it was the absence of good. Similar to how cold really isn't a thing as it is the absence of heat, or darkness isn't really a thing in and of itself as it is the absence of light. Augustine also emphasized the importance of free will and the decision of Satan to turn against God. To summarize, the picture of Satan that the church eventually constructed was an aggregate one, and this process that we arrived at this aggregate was very organic over time. There was never a church council where all the important theologians sat down and answered the question, what is the devil? What's his background? Where did he come from? And what is going to happen to him? Rather, there were different theological themes that the church picked up, refined, and pieced together to form the face of the devil that we all know from church history. While this may seem like a very artificial way of dealing with the problem of evil, nevertheless, I think it was the right move. By putting together a form of Satan, an idea of what Satan is, the church defined what evil is. And again, remember, with Clement of Alexandria and with St. Augustine, evil was identified as the privation of good. And so by giving evil a face and a name in the character of Satan, they were able to talk about evil not just abstractly, but on a very personal level. This is to say that the early Christians didn't invent the idea of Satan ex nihilo. They experienced evil on a daily basis, and they experienced evil on a philosophical level as well. So evil exists in the world. It's a philosophical problem, but it's also an imminent problem. It's a problem that you and I are going to experience just as people living back then did. So it's an experience problem and it's a philosophical problem. With these two problems, which are really one problem combined, the church began looking for information that would help describe and understand and appreciate where evil came from, why there's evil in the world given the plans of a good God, and what's going to happen with evil in the end. What is the relationship between evil and God? What is the relationship between evil and humankind? In other words, the church fathers weren't building a statue out of nothing, they were rather clothing an invisible entity. And once it had been clothed, once it had been given a name and given a face, they were able to talk about evil in a way that they weren't able to in pure abstracta. This, I think, is a really good segue into the final section of this video. How should we today think of the figure of Satan? And the answers that I say here are going to be really interesting, I think, because I changed my mind several times over the course of doing research on this video. So here goes. I think after reviewing the biblical data that we find ourselves at something of an impasse. On the one hand, we find that Satan doesn't make an appearance in the Old Testament. If there was a person out there, a fallen angel who was going about causing trouble and mischief, I feel like this figure would show up in the Old Testament. But as we've shown here, the figure of Satan doesn't appear there. When the figure of Satan does appear in the Second Temple period and in early references in the New Testament, what we find is the result of a long series of refinements until we get the ultimate picture of the Prince of Darkness that we encounter in the Second Temple period. So, on the one hand, the data seems to suggest that there isn't really a person, or at least the person in the story of Satan that we're all familiar with doesn't seem to be accurate to life. On the other hand, Satan was understood in the Second Temple period, in the New Testament, and in the early Christian period as a reference to the embodiment of evil itself. And I'm afraid that if we dispose of the figure of the devil and say that there's nothing to it, we risk downplaying the imminence, the realness, and the painfulness of evil as it's experienced both imminently to ourselves and with the philosophical problem of evil that we all have to wrestle with. I'm going to suggest as my own conclusion, which you are completely free to disagree with, whether you be a Christian, an atheist, or anything else, but my own conclusion is that the devil exists, just not in a personal manner. And here's what I mean by that. I think we should understand the devil itself as the manifestation of human-oriented evil. That's to say, all the evil that human beings are capable of producing on earth are manifestations of evil and something called Satan. This conclusion takes very seriously both the biblical data itself as well as the very imminent problem of evil itself. It doesn't disregard the biblical data that suggests that Satan wasn't present in the Old Testament while still affirming the fact that evil objectively exists and needs to be combated. So I think we should understand Satan as a symbolic manifestation of all human evil in the world. And if that seems too light to some of you, if it seems like I'm not taking it seriously, or if others think they could just disregard this interpretation, let me attempt to convince you otherwise. The way I'm going to do that is by asking if you believe in the Grim Reaper. I'm guessing most of you are going to say, no, of course the Grim Reaper isn't a person walking around somewhere that kills people, even though this is a symbolic representation that we see in a lot of media and that we all instantly recognize to be a symbol of the manifestation of death. Nevertheless, anybody who said no to that answer still believes in the existence of death itself. We remain terrified of death. We don't want death to happen to our loved ones, and we're horrified when death happens when it doesn't have to. I think this is a good parallel to our understanding of Satan. Satan exists in the same way that the Grim Reaper exists. There may not be a person trundling around in the darkness looking to kill or cause evil upon people, but evil itself is a very real manifestation. And when it manifests in a person, that's the devil manifesting itself in a person. Just like how when someone dies or something dies, that's death manifesting itself in front of you. There may not be a spiritual person behind the event, but the event still takes place, whether you like it or not. So just because there isn't a body or a personality doesn't mean that the thing itself doesn't exist. Evil itself does exist, even if you can't put it in a bottle and run experiments on it. Harkening back to the theology of Clement of Alexandria and St. Augustine earlier, evil is the privation of good. You can't weigh evil, you can't run experiments on evil with an electron microscope, but likewise, cold doesn't exist either. You can't put cold in a bottle, you can't run experiments on cold, and yet we experience cold. It's part of human phenomenology. It's something that we experience as both the abstract idea of cold and as something imminent to ourselves when we step outside on a snowy day. Likewise, darkness technically doesn't exist. You can't run experiments on it, you can't grab hold of it, and yet, whenever there's the absence of light, we say it's dark. We don't like the dark because we can't see in the dark. Darkness very clearly exists even though it doesn't have a form or substance. I would suggest that something very similar happens with Satan. Satan does very much exist, even if he doesn't have a body or a personality that can be experimented on and thus confirmed empirically. Nevertheless, he exists because evil exists. Satan's just as real as cold or darkness or the absence of good, which is evil itself. And I also think that the anthropomorphic representation of Satan, the idea of giving this evil a name and giving it a face and giving it a form that walks around and tempts Job, is actually a very useful heuristic. Humans relate to things in human ways. This is why whenever we watch a children's movie about animals going about their days, they go about their days wearing human clothes, driving human cars, going to human jobs, and returning back to human homes, despite being represented as animals. Because humans interact with things in a human way, we tend to anthropomorphize things in order to make them more relatable to our own experiences. This is perhaps one of the reasons why the ancient gods of the ancient world were manifested in humanoid forms. When the ancients needed to relate to whatever force was in control of the water cycle in ancient Phoenicia, they gave it a name, they gave it a face, and they gave it a form so that they could establish a relationship with it. That name was Baal. Baal exists insofar as the water cycle exists. There may not be a personality behind it, but they needed a way to understand the water cycle in terms of human referent. Something similar happens with the symbolism of the Grim Reaper. We know that there isn't a skeleton in a black robe with a sickle running around harvesting souls of the dead, but at the same time, by giving death a form, which we do in all different sorts of media, we can approach death. We can begin to contemplate it and appreciate it as an abstract idea given form. Therefore, I would suggest that the devil is very real insofar as cold and darkness are real, and that it's even very useful to represent the devil as having a physical form because it makes it more understandable in human ways. I think this gives us the best of both worlds. It allows us to read the New Testament and the references to Satan there as referring to something very real. Satan operates on the hearts of all humankind, as he did with Peter and with Judas. And that's a very real phenomenon. Evil itself is very real, and it's near lying in wait for all humankind. And yet, Satan doesn't seem to be a person, because he doesn't show up in the Old Testament itself. And if Satan were a person, I think we would expect to meet him there at least once or twice. Now, all that being said, I do want to remain very tentative about my conclusions here. We are talking about the manifestation of all evil. And if there is indeed a personality behind it, I would be doing everyone a great disservice by trying to take that understanding away from you.
So I am personally trying to wrestle through the data from the Old Testament and the data from the New Testament and figuring out how I should think of Satan. If you want to go on believing that Satan is a person, you have every right to do that. Don't let me take that away from you. In fact, I would rather you believe that Satan is a person rather than disbelieve in Satan entirely. Because as I've said, even in my view, Satan very much exists as the embodiment of evil. But it's also worth noting that a lot of people have had experiences with what they believe to be spiritual beings of evil and darkness, which harass them, cause them trouble, and seem to manifest as demons, devils, and even Satan himself. Now, it's easy to write these off as hallucinations, misfirings of the neurons, or bad drug trips. But at the same time, people have had these consistently over many different cultures and many different times. That's not to say that every one of these experiences is the same, and that's not to say that every report of these experiences is true. There is variation between the experiences, and some people make things up just for attention or for other benefits. But that being said, enough people have had these experiences that makes me careful about concluding that there is no personality behind the spiritual form of evil. I don't find a whole lot of evidence for it in the Bible itself, but that being said, there may well be something out there. And if there is something lurking around in the dark, perhaps it was this face staring back at us from the gloomy murk of our dreams that inspired the depiction of a devil in Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, and in the New Testament. In other words, Satan has a name, and Satan has a face, and Satan has a form. Whether there's actually any life or spirit behind the eyes of that face, I do not know. But one thing I do know is that when humankind stares out in the darkness does stare back at us. And I want to seriously reiterate that this isn't a decision that we should arrive at flippantly or treat the problem of evil flippantly. Either Satan is a spirit that's working in the hearts of all human people to try to lure them away from God, or he's an abstract force of evil that led to the deaths of 100 million people within living memory. One way or another, Satan is real, and he is evil, and he wants you, and we cannot afford to take that lightly. This video is coming out in 2025, a time marked by international armed conflicts and civil unrest. If you doubt the existence of evil, think about any of the situations going on right now. I don't particularly care which one or which side you take on that one. But I'm sure you can see examples of evil itself being played out on the stage of humankind right now in some part of the world. If I'm right, that's the devil's doing. That's Satan himself. That's evil manifesting itself in humankind. So please, 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 whatever you conclude, do not come away from this video thinking that evil can be taken lightly. I have a few concluding statements I'd like to leave you with, as well as some book recommendations in case anybody would like to research this topic further, either to ultimately agree with me or to try to prove me wrong. So first off, some things for my fellow Christians. If you're anything like me, then the research you were exposed to during the course of this video may have rattled your understanding of the theological world just a little bit. It certainly did mine, led to a lot of sleepless nights and struggles that I had to overcome. So I want to start by saying that if it would cause a whole theological trauma for you to reorient your understanding of the devil, you can absolutely go on believing that the devil is a person who is lurking behind the evil intentions of humankind and is opposed to God. That is a model that is on the table, and it cannot be disproven. But regardless of the conclusion that you draw from this video, I think it's necessary for us to reframe how we understand the devil in modern American theology. Again, I think we place far too much emphasis on the role of the devil as the equal opposite of God, sometimes putting the devil and God on the same playing field when God is dramatically beyond anything the devil could ever aspire to be. The point of the myth of Satan and Satan's fall is that it was Satan's folly that led him to rise up against God, whom he could never seriously hope to dethrone. That's kind of the emphasis of it. And yet we still understand Satan and God to work in such a dualistic manner, as if they're two equal opposites, when they're very clearly not. And this leads me to another point. A lot of people who have their belief in the devil compromised will start questioning everything. If you can't believe the devil is a person, can you believe that God is a person? Can you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Everything else goes into crisis mode. But again, the devil isn't as theologically important as we make him out to be, I don't think. Again, in Paul's near systematic expression of his own thoughts in the book of Romans, the devil doesn't play a particularly large role there. We gave the devil the power that he has by making him such a big deal. And so I think it's actually totally possible to have a non-personal view of the devil and still fit within a proper Christian framework of theology for the world. It's a little bit strange. It's a little bit unusual. I'm getting used to it myself. But nevertheless, I think the data compels me to move to this direction. I also want to point out that a lot of conclusions drawn by people who disbelieve in the devil are drawn from their presuppositions. A lot of people, Christians or non-Christians, who don't believe in the devil disbelieve in the devil's existence because of metaphysical reasons. They're incredulous that such a character could ever exist. But that's not the road that got me here. The reason that I am suggesting the devil wasn't a person is because I followed the biblical data. The same methods and the same data that led me to believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead is the same data that led me to believe and conclude that the devil probably isn't a person, though again, I can't rule that out. I also want to emphasize that it's not belief in the devil that makes you a Christian. It's belief in Jesus, and that's something that I still hold to very firmly. I affirm that Jesus physically rose from the dead after 3 days of actually dying under crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. These are conclusions that I draw, and I consider myself a proud Christian to this day. Again, we give the devil too much credit if we suggest that a proper or improper view of the devil disqualifies somebody from being a Christian. If there are any Christians out there who would like a more classical interpretation of the idea of Satan and Satan's fall, I would highly recommend the video that Gavin Ortlund did on the topic. It's very long and it's very thorough. I, of course, disagree with Dr. Ortlund's interpretation of the data, but nevertheless, if you're looking for an alternative explanation, then I would suggest checking out that video. I've even linked it here in the description and in the pinned comment below. Now let me address all of the non-Christians in the audience. I hope, as I said at the beginning of this video, that if you didn't believe in the devil before, that you do now. Think about a conflict in the world right now. Doesn't matter which one, doesn't matter which side you're taking. Think about the death, destruction, and horror that's being wrought on the human stage right now as you're watching this video. That is Satan. That is evil itself being manifest. Even if there was no person behind the devil is an excellent heuristic for understanding evil in the world today. Just because there is no personality behind the Grim Reaper doesn't mean that death isn't real. Just because there may not be a personality behind the figure of Satan doesn't mean that evil isn't real. At the same time, I am also very terrified that there may be a ghost in the machine. Although it seems that the biblical data suggests that the person of Satan shouldn't be taken literally, it nevertheless remains possible that there is something whispering into the ears of the human soul, convincing it to do one thing or the other. I can't prove it, I can't empirically demonstrate it, in fact it's impossible to do so, but I also can't rule it out entirely. I guess what I'm saying is evil is real, and we need to be very, very careful about it. Regardless of who we are, Christian or non-Christian, evil is out there, and it wants you. And if you find yourself doing evil things, if you look around your life and find yourself carrying out evil, then the devil already has you. All right, now on to some reading recommendations. If anybody disagrees with the conclusions drawn here and favors the classical model of Satan, demons, and angels, I can't recommend more highly The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. He likewise has another book called Demons, which goes deeper into evil spirits, and another book called Angels, which likewise goes into details on good spirits. Heiser maintains and defends the traditional model of Satan and does a decent enough job of reading the Old Testament texts as if they're referring to this figure. Of course, I don't agree with Dr. Heiser's conclusions, but if you are looking for an expression of these ideas, I would say Heiser is about as good as it gets. I would also highly recommend the 4-part series by Jeffrey Burton Russell, which traces the history of the concept of Satan and its expression in various points of time. The first of these is The Devil, which begins with a philosophical exploration of the problem of evil before going into the concept of evil in the Old Testament period, classical Hebrew thought, as well as classical Greek philosophy. The second section, Satan, which is a separate book, talks about the idea of Satan in early Christianity, both the New Testament and in the time period of the earliest parts of the church. Finally, the book Lucifer, by the same author, goes into the idea of Satan in the medieval ages. If you can't tell that Dr. Russell is a medievalist, look at the size of the books, and you'll notice that the one covering the medieval era is substantially larger than the other ones. There's a fourth entry into this series that I don't have a hard copy of called Mephistopheles. The Mephistopheles book is focused on the idea of Satan from the Enlightenment period to the modern day, the devil in the modern world. It's a very interesting book. I don't have a physical copy of it, but I'd highly recommend that one as well. I do want to offer a slight critique of Dr. Russell's work, however. Because the scope is so large, he's trying to cover a lot of ground, and because he's dealing with realms that he's not a specialist in, some of the details that are covered are If not incorrect, they're left with low-resolution discussion and solutions. This is to say, Dr. Russell is a medievalist. He specializes in medieval European literature, but he's talking about the idea of Satan in ancient Israelite literature, in ancient Christian literature, in ancient Islamic literature. And so sometimes, at least in my experience, I found areas where he's demonstrably not necessarily wrong, but he's taking a very idiosyncratic view on a couple of things. So I'd say read him with a grain of salt, but still an excellent resource for trying to acquire information on this topic. Another book that I would highly recommend is Demons and Spirits in Old Testament Theology, written by John Walton and J. Harvey Walton. If you want something to balance out Dr. Heiser's more, I would say, maximalistic approach to demons and spirits in the Old Testament, I would say that this is the one. So if you're looking for two books that take two very different perspectives on this to contrast each other with, I would say that Walton and Heiser are the two names to look for that. The Waltons take many of the same conclusions that I draw from, which is somewhat unsurprising given that I was one of Dr. Walton's students, but at the same time, I didn't consult this book any more or less than I did the other books in this entry. So I recommend using it as a way of countering the more maximalistic approach of Michael Heiser. Another book I'd recommend, which I don't have a physical copy of, is The Ancient Enemy by Neil Forsyth. Forsyth's approach is looking at comparisons between the old Chaos Kampf myths and the figure of Satan. There's definitely something to be said here. I didn't rely on a lot of that in my own presentation here, but it is certainly one of the best treatments of the idea of Satan throughout history. So The Ancient Enemy by Neil Forsyth is definitely a must read. Finally, if you're a Christian and especially a Catholic who is somewhat bothered by the discussion here, I would highly recommend a book called The Devil by Father James Woods. This book came out in 1970 and was written primarily as a critique of the demonology expressed in the movie The Exorcist. That's kind of the main focus offered by the author. But that being said, the author has a keen interest in the idea of demons, devils, and the occult in modern literature and in modern media. And he does a really good job of exploring the figure of the devil from a Catholic perspective. I found Father Woods to be very open-minded while still remaining very committed to the core truths of Christianity, as you would expect from a Catholic priest. He actually goes against a lot of early Christian tradition by acknowledging that the serpent in the garden wasn't to be identified with the devil. He also reads Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as referring to figures aside from the devil himself, while still maintaining the existence of Satan as something of a personal being itself. I was very impressed by Father Woods' work, and I intend to read more of it as time goes on. And thus concludes The Devil, a Biography. Thank you all so much for sticking with me to the end of this one. This is substantially longer than what you're used to with this channel, so if you like the more long-form ideas, then please give me some feedback on that. Let me know if you like it. If you prefer something a little bit more bite-sized or perhaps breaking this down into parts, let me know that as well. I'd be happy to take that insight into account. I'm going to try to continue releasing these weekly, although with scheduling and with certain things going up with work, I might have to delay a couple of them from time to time, but right now I believe I am still on track to release the next episode shortly after this one. If you think this video deserved it, then please leave me a like, a comment, or perhaps even a subscription if I piqued your interest well enough. Thank you all so much for your time. Take care of yourselves and watch out, because the devil wants you, and he's real. If you look around and see yourself doing evil in the world, then he's already got you. Take care, and don't let the devil bite. I'll see you all next time.